Ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
You know, when you're so ready for the next movie in a franchise, but at the same time, kind of dreading it, like
Yeah.
deep down, you just know it's not going to be as good.
Oh, yeah. Like that sequel fatigue.
Exactly. It's like franchise fatigue in a nutshell.
Ah.
And today, we're diving deep into a prime example, Saw V. This was supposed to be the movie that brought the series back to its roots.
Revitalize it.
Right, but did it? We've got a review here that really digs into what went right and wrong.
Okay.
One of the first things they point out is that opening trap. And I don't want to spoil anything for those who haven't seen it, but it's classic Saw. Super gruesome.
Yeah.
But the review says it lacks that ingenuity of the earlier films.
Yeah.
Like they focus more on just upping the gore factor than on crafting a truly memorable trap.
I see. Yeah, it's like this pressure to just constantly escalate,
Right.
to keep topping themselves with the gore. But sometimes that comes at the expense of the things that made it so effective in the first place.
It's like they forget about building the suspense and the psychology of it all.
Exactly. The early Saw films, they were terrifying, not just because of the blood and guts, but because the traps were so intricate, so psychological.
They made you think.
Exactly. They forced the characters and the audience to confront these really uncomfortable truths about human nature. And I think that's something Saw V kind of missed the mark on.
And that brings us to another point the review raises. The characters.
Or the lack thereof.
Yeah, well, put it this way. The review says Saw V relies more on archetypes than actual characters.
Yeah.
Like we get a quick rundown of their sins,
Right.
and then they're just thrown into the game.
Yeah, you don't really connect with them at any emotional level.
Exactly. And as the review points out, even the most gruesome death scene falls flat if you don't care about the character who's biting it.
It's true. Think about some of the most memorable horror films out there. What
Right.
makes them stick with you? It's not just the jump scares. It's the characters. We root for them. We fear for them. Without that emotional connection, it's just a spectacle, you know?
It's true. So we've got these traps that are more about shock than substance,
Right.
and these characters that feel kind of one-dimensional.
Yeah.
What about the new Jigsaw in town, Mark Hoffman? Does he live up to John Kramer's legacy?
Well, this is where things get interesting. The review uses a very specific word to describe how John Kramer is portrayed in Saw V, omniscient.
Omniscient, meaning he knows everything.
Yeah, even from beyond the grave. It's like the filmmakers were so determined to maintain Jigsaw's genius that they gave him this almost supernatural level of foresight.
So you're saying it's hard to feel any suspense when it feels like everything's going according to a predetermined plan.
Exactly. Where's the room for surprise? For those genuine twists and turns that the series was known for.
That's a really good point.
And this is where the comparison to Amanda Young comes into play. Remember her? Jigsaw's apprentice.
Oh, yeah.
She was struggling with her own demons, her own interpretation of Jigsaw's philosophy.
She had her own thing going on.
Exactly. She was a much more complex character than just a follower. And while Hoffman is arguably more developed than Amanda, he still lacks that crucial depth.
Like he's missing something.
Yeah, he doesn't have that same twisted moral code, the same philosophical underpinnings that made Jigsaw so compelling.
It's like the difference between a master artist and someone just trying to copy their style. You can see the brushstrokes, but the soul is missing.
Exactly. And this lack of depth extends to Hoffman's personal revenge plot, which, according to the review, falls a little flat.
So why didn't it land with the same impact? What went wrong there?
The review offers a few possibilities. One is pacing. Maybe the movie just rushes through Hoffman's backstory without giving it enough emotional weight, so the audience doesn't fully connect with his motivations. Or maybe it's simply that Hoffman as a character is just overshadowed by Jigsaw's legacy.
It's always a challenge for a sequel to try and introduce a new antagonist who can live up to the original, especially when the original was so iconic.
Indeed. And that challenge is only amplified when the franchise is trying to rely on the same formula, the same shock tactics, without evolving the core elements that made it successful in the first place.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to recapture lightning in a bottle. But Saw V doesn't just introduce a new Jigsaw. They try to bring back some familiar elements, too. Like the review mentions, they tried to revive the whole detective storyline with Agent Strom. Did that work any better?
Unfortunately, the review seems to think it falls into the same traps, so to speak.
So instead of building new suspense,
Yeah.
it's more like retreading old ground.
Exactly. They were so concerned with reminding the audience of what they loved about the previous films that they forgot to give them something new.
It's a tough balance to strike, though.
Right.
Like, you want to give the fans what they want, but you also have to push the boundaries a bit.
Exactly. And speaking of familiar territory, the review doesn't hold back when it comes to Savi's ending.
Ah, yes. The make-or-break moment for any good horror movie.
Hmm.
What do they have to say about this one?
Well, without giving anything away, the review suggests that Strom's fate feels kind of predictable.
So even with the ending,
Yeah.
it's a bit been there, done that.
Yeah, sadly. And the way Hoffman's story wraps up just reinforces that feeling. Like, instead of subverting expectations, just gives into the same old tropes.
It's like a missed opportunity to really shake things up.
Mm.
But you know what might be the most interesting criticism? The review says that Savi's biggest problem is actually its plot holes and inconsistencies.
That's where the franchise fatigue really becomes impossible to ignore, because it's not just about one movie anymore, it's about the whole world they've built.
It's like you're watching a magic trick, and you're totally sucked in, but then the magician reveals how it's done, and suddenly it's not so impressive anymore.
Exactly. The review points out these inconsistencies with Hoffman's timeline, and when you really think about it, it creates these logistical impossibilities with how he was involved in the previous films.
So you're saying it's not just that the plot is hard to follow,
Hmm.
it straight up contradicts itself.
In some ways, yes. That's a tough pill to swallow, even for diehard fans. It's like the rules of the game have changed, but nobody told you.
Which makes you question everything that came before.
Right,
It's like you see the cracks in the foundation,
right.
and you start to wonder how sturdy the whole thing really is.
Exactly. And that's often how a franchise starts to crumble, when the audience loses faith in the world you've created.
Like a house of cards, just waiting for a stiff breeze to come along. Sure. So before we write off Saw V completely, let's look at the review's conclusion. What's the overall verdict? So we've talked about the traps, the characters, even the timeline itself. Does Saw V make it out alive, or does it get buried under the weight of all those sequels?
The review's pretty blunt about it. They called it a valiant effort, but ultimately, it's dragged down by the franchise's own legacy.
A valiant effort, but doomed to fail. Is that what we're saying?
Well, the bigger question is, can any franchise truly escape that fate? I mean, they seem to think it's possible, but it takes real effort to avoid those pitfalls.
So what could they have done differently with Saw V, or even just in general?
Honestly, it sounds simple, but it's about going back to basics. Why did people fall in love with this franchise in the first place?
Right. Like, what was that spark?
Yeah, exactly. Fresh ideas, interesting characters. You got to be willing to change things up, but without losing sight of what made the original so great.
Finding that sweet spot between giving fans what they know and love and still surprising them.
Right. It's like when a chef takes another look at an old recipe, they can tweak it, add some new flavors, but you don't want to completely change what made it work in the first place.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that takes knowing your audience. What are they hoping for? What do they want to see more of? How can you subvert those expectations?
And sometimes that means being critical, even when it's something you love.
It's like they say, you gotta be cruel to be kind.
Well, maybe not cruel, but you get the idea. Sometimes the most dedicated fans are the ones who are willing to say, hey, this isn't doing it for me.
And who knows? Maybe that's how a franchise gets back on track.
Yeah.
By listening to those honest critiques.
It's all about keeping things fresh and exciting.
Well said. That's a great place to wrap up, I think. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into the Saw franchise, where we explored the fine line between fan service and franchise fatigue.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, remember, don't be afraid to demand more from the things you love. Until next time, keep it critical.